Hi, I'm Pastor Kerry. Have you ever known of someone who went for some sort of medical treatment and for whatever reason it didn't accomplish what they wanted it to accomplish? And so they went for a second attempt and it still didn't accomplish what they wanted it to accomplish. And so then they went for a third attempt, and after the third attempt maybe they were even worse off than they were to begin with. And the cycle just continues until the point comes where finally they have spent a whole lot of money and things, if anything, have gotten worse than they were in the very beginning. You know, something that comes to mind for me are people who have had facelifts, and maybe you can think of a celebrity or two that has had that happen to them. I don't want to name names because I don't think that would be very kind, but you can probably think of a celebrity or two. I know that I can think of a celebrity or two who had facelift after facelift after facelift, and ultimately they just completely destroyed their face. And it's incredibly tragic. But things like that unfortunately happen sometimes. People go to try to make a medical issue better, and it ends up just getting worse and worse and worse. And the reason I bring that up today is because in our lectionary text today, it's going to talk about a woman who went through a similar circumstance a couple thousand years ago. This morning, our lectionary scripture is Mark chapter 5, verses 21 through 43. And so I'd like to go ahead and read that scripture to you right now. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders, a man named Jairus, came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with Jesus, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with Jairus. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman who was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, "If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed." And immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "Well, you see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, trembling with fear, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some of the people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told Jairus, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this, and he told them to give her something to eat. May God bless the reading of the Word. So this is a pretty amazing passage, and one of the things I'm sure you noticed is that in this passage, we kind of get two miracles for the price of one. And so what I'd like to do right now is I'd like to do what we always do. I'd like to go ahead and take a little bit closer look at the passage and point some additional things out to you. After we talk through the passage, then we'll focus on the lessons that this passage has for us on what we should do as we act on our faith. So the very beginning of the passage, it tells us that Jesus and the disciples have crossed from the other side of the lake. In this particular case, they were crossing from the west side of the lake over to the east side. Actually, I got that backwards. They had crossed from the east side of the lake over to the west side. And basically what that meant is they had crossed from the Gentile side of the lake, the east side where they had just been, over to the west side of the lake, essentially the Jewish side of the lake. And as soon as they arrived, they were immediately mobbed by this crowd. And so at this point in Jesus' ministry, even though we're only in Mark chapter 5, Jesus is well known and people are following him probably because he's a miracle worker and maybe for his teaching as well. But he's famous, he's popular, he's well known. And one of the people that has come to see him is a synagogue leader, which is pretty unusual, and we'll talk more about that here in a few minutes. But the man's name is Jairus, and he's come specifically because he is hoping that Jesus can come and heal his daughter, who is very sick. So Jesus agrees, and they take off for Jairus' house, but in the meantime, apparently there was another woman who had heard that Jesus was going to be there, but she didn't go and approach Jesus the way that Jairus had. Instead, she has it in her mind that all she has to do is just touch his clothing, and that she will be healed. And the incredible thing is, she was right. She just slips through the crowd and just touches the edge of Jesus' clothing, and indeed, she is healed. And immediately Jesus knows that divine power, healing power has gone through him, and so he stops. And he says, "Who did that?" And I have a feeling that Jesus knew. But what he wanted to do is he wanted everybody to know what had happened. And Jesus wanted to commend this woman for her faith. And Jesus wanted everybody to know that her faith had healed her. And so he calls her out. And at first she is very reluctant to reveal herself. But finally she steps forward, she admits what she's done. And I love what Jesus says to her here. Jesus says, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." It was her faith that had healed her. And it's important for us to understand the difficult situation that this woman had been in, because she had had this bleeding issue. The Bible doesn't go into what specifically it was. We could probably take a guess or two. But regardless, she had had this issue for 12 years. And she had gone and spent all the money that she had trying to fix the problem. And unfortunately, the doctors 2,000 years ago, it tells us that they had just made the situation worse for her. And the real problem for her was not just this medical issue that she had, but when you had a problem that caused you to be bleeding, you were considered to be unclean. You were basically like a leper in this culture. And so this woman, because of this medical issue that she had, she was cut off from her family, from her friends. She had to act as if she was a leper and had to stay separate from them because she was unclean because of this issue. And can you imagine how miserable that would have been for this woman to be cut off from everyone that she cared about for 12 years? So, when she is healed from this, this is truly an incredible moment for her. And undoubtedly for her family, for the people that cared about her, she was finally restored. Now, this is obviously a great thing that has just happened, but at the same moment that this great thing has just happened, now something really sad happens. Some people come to Jairus from his home and say, "Jairus, just let the rabbi go, because your daughter's dead now." And Jesus says, "Wait." And he speaks to Jairus and he says, "Look," he says, "I don't want you to be afraid. I want you just to keep on believing." And so then Jesus, it tells us that he just took 3 of the disciples with him at this point instead of all 12. It says that he took Peter, James, and John. We know that Jesus considered these 3 to be kind of the inner circle out of the 12 disciples. And there are other places in the Gospels where he chooses to do something with just these 3. This is one of those occasions. And so they continue on They get to the house, and it tells us that when they get to Jairus' house, that there are people that are just wailing and mourning. And then something that takes place might seem kind of strange to us, but once you understand the culture 2,000 years ago, it might start to make a little more sense. So Jesus gets to this house where everyone is just completely beside themselves, apparently with grief. And Jesus says, "Hey, don't worry, she's just asleep." And the people start laughing at Jesus. Why would they do that? I mean, wouldn't they be hopeful when Jesus says this to them? Well, one of the things that's going to seem really strange to you if you weren't aware of this, but 2,000 years ago, in biblical times, if you had money, then you would hire professional mourners when someone from your household passed away. And I know that seems incredibly foreign to us, but I'm telling you, that's what they did in biblical times. If you could afford it, you would hire biblical mourners. And so, if you've got a bunch of people there who are ostensibly mourning, in this case for your daughter, and then this Jesus guy that maybe you've heard about him being a miracle worker, maybe you haven't heard about him at all, but he comes in and says that this girl that you are pretty sure is dead, he comes in and says, "Don't worry, she's just asleep." Well, if you don't really care about the girl because you are being paid to be there mourning, then you're going to laugh. And that's exactly what some of them did. But then it says that Jesus kicked everybody out, and rightfully so. And it says that Jesus at this point just takes the girl's parents and takes the 3 disciples in, and that he takes the girl by the hand. And what I want to point out to you just very quickly here is that Jesus was doing something that if he wasn't sure that he could raise this girl from the dead, that he was doing something pretty risky here. Because if you touched a dead body, then you were ceremonially unclean. And Jesus, just like this woman who had touched him, had to separate herself from society for 12 straight years. Now Jesus was going to have to separate himself from everybody else by touching this dead girl's hand. And again, I know you might be thinking to yourself, well, that seems odd or that seems backward. And I hear you, but that's how culture worked in biblical times. But of course, Jesus knew what he was capable of, or rather what God was capable of accomplishing through him. And so Jesus says, "Talitha cum." And that is Aramaic, as the passage tells us, for "Little girl, I say to you, get up." And you may recall, or maybe you didn't necessarily recall, that there are about 8 places in the New Testament where we have words recorded in Aramaic. And then in most of those cases, not all, but most of those cases, we also have the explanation of the meaning of those words. We have the translation. And in this case, Mark offers us the translation. Some other places where we have the original Aramaic in the New Testament, we have when Jesus says, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," when he's on the cross. When Paul talks about, we say, "Abba, Father." When Jesus says, "Don't say to someone, Raka." And the list goes on. Like I said, about 8 places in the New Testament where we do have Aramaic words. And just as a quick reminder, so if what I'm saying to you isn't making a lot of sense, in biblical times, the people, when they talked to each other, they spoke a language called Aramaic. Like when you and I talk to each other, we speak English to each other. But the interesting thing is that although they spoke in Aramaic to one another, when people wrote, they wrote in Greek. And so just about everybody that lived 2,000 years ago, well, they were bilingual because they spoke to each other in Aramaic, but they wrote in Greek. But there are about 6 places in the New Testament, 8 places in the New Testament, where for whatever reason, the New Testament author thinks, I'm going to write this in the original Aramaic. Maybe it made an impression on them. Maybe there's something that the Aramaic could convey that maybe the Greek couldn't convey. Anyway, This is one of those 6 or 8 places in the New Testament. And at the very end of this passage, the girl gets up and she goes out, and that is the happy ending to the story, to both stories, to both miracles that we have in this passage. But what I want us to do right now is I want us to go ahead and I want us to talk about the lessons that this passage has for us about what happens when we act in faith. Because in this passage, we see not just one, but we see 2 brave individuals act on faith. We see Jairus act on faith, and we see this woman who had this medical issue act in faith. So, the first lesson is this. Acting in faith might mean that we ignore religious pressure at times. Acting in faith might mean that we ignore religious pressure at times. And I know you're thinking to yourself, Pastor Kerry, what on earth are you talking about? So, in this passage, it tells us that Jairus wasn't just any guy. It tells us that Jairus was the leader of the local synagogue. And here's the thing. At this point in Jesus' ministry, the Hebrew religious leaders were not pro-Jesus. At this point in Jesus' ministry, the Hebrew religious leaders were pretty well united against Jesus. At best, they thought that he was wrong, that he was mistaken. And so for Jairus to go and treat Jesus as if he was a miracle worker, as if he was divine, well, that wasn't going to fly if he had discussed it ahead of time with all of his colleagues, with all of the other Hebrew religious leaders. But he did. He trusted that by doing this, that he would have a chance to have his daughter healed from her illness. He probably had no idea that she was going to be raised from the dead. And friends, the reason that I bring this point up, acting in faith, might mean that we ignore religious pressure at times. Look, it's not fun to talk about, but the reality is that over the last 2,000 years, there have been churches that have done things that were wrong. There have been church leaders that have been in the wrong. And there have been times when, undoubtedly, people discussed with the church leaders, hey, I think you're wrong about this. I think we're wrong about this. We need to do what's right here. And I am sure, I'm sure because I've seen it firsthand, that there have been times when religious leaders placed religious pressure on others to, hey, just keep that to yourself, or hey, don't go out there and don't go rock the boat. And friends, look, again, I don't want to cite specific denominations. I don't want to cite specific churches or specific individuals. But you know that's happened. I know that's happened. And in some cases, it has been devastating. And so, my friend, I'm telling you, if you are feeling at some point convicted that a pastor or a priest or any sort of religious leader is in the wrong, then I would encourage you to be brave and to act in faith and to go confront that individual. And if that individual doesn't own up to it, then you need to talk to the leaders of the church. And friends, sometimes it's an entire church that's in the wrong. And you need to go talk to the leaders of that church and tell them. And if they don't acknowledge that they're in the wrong, well then maybe it's time for you to find a new church. Look, I know that this is uncomfortable, but we can't just turn a blind eye towards individuals or entire churches or entire denominations that are in the wrong. Acting in faith might mean that we ignore the pressure that would otherwise be placed on us, to just ignore it, overlook it, toe the company line. That is the first lesson that we can take from Jairus in this passage. The second lesson we can take from the woman in this passage. Acting in faith might mean that we seem irrational at times. Acting in faith might mean that we seem irrational at times. I am sure that if this woman had said to her friends, and who knows, maybe she did, but if this woman had said to her friends, hey, I hear that Jesus guy is going to be here tomorrow, and I'm just going to go and I'm going to try to touch just the edge of his clothing, because I think maybe I'll be healed. What do you think her friends would have said to her? So we don't know if she did or not. But the point is, she did what probably would have seemed irrational, what probably would have seemed crazy to people back then. And look what happened as a result. She was healed. And she was finally going to be able to return to society, return to her loved ones, to become a part of her culture once again. And friends, I don't know if God has ever put something on your heart that might seem a little crazy to you or might have seemed a little crazy to others. There's been a time or two in my life when God put something on my heart that I know probably seemed a little bit crazy to the people that I shared it with. Maybe it even seemed a little bit crazy to me at times. And I wonder if maybe there's something that God has put on your heart right now that maybe you just haven't acted on, because you're afraid that maybe you're going to seem a little irrational if you do this. Friends, I would encourage you to prayerfully consider this thing that God has put on your heart, if there's something there right now. And then finally, the third lesson that we should take away from this passage is this. Acting in faith might mean that we hold on to hope against all hope at times. Acting in faith might mean that we hold on to hope against all hope at times. And this, of course, is a lesson that we take from our friend Jairus in this passage. Because halfway through the passage, Jairus has his friends come to him and say, Jairus, sorry, it's not going to work. Your daughter's dead. And so you just need to let this rabbi named Jesus, you just need to let him go. But Jairus didn't do that. And even when they get to the house and Jesus says, hey, everybody, don't worry. And everybody laughed at him. Even then, Jairus continued to hold on to hope against all hope. And because of Jairus' faith, and because he held on to hope even when it started to seem completely hopeless, his little girl was raised from the dead. And friends, we, as people of faith, we are also people of hope. You've probably heard me say before that as Christians, we are children of hope. And so, again, I would ask you, what is it that you're hoping for right now? Why are you choosing right now to hold on to hope against all hope? Is there something that you're holding on to, something that you're hoping for right now? If so, then I would simply encourage you, keep praying and trust that in one way or another, God is going to answer your prayer. God is going to make it clear to you what God's will has been all along.